There are moments in your life that are not moments at all, but entire geological epochs compressed into a single, silent frame. They are the pressure points where the tectonic plates of your personal history shift, grinding against one another with imperceptible slowness until, all at once, a fault line gives way. The landscape of your heart is irrevocably altered, and you can only stand in the quiet aftermath and wonder how you never felt the trembling. For me, that earthquake was the weight of his head in my lap. It was a Tuesday night, I think, or maybe a Thursday. The specific day had been ground to dust by the relentless sameness of the week, but the moment itself remains crystalline, a perfect fossil preserved in the amber of my memory. He was asleep, his breathing a soft, rhythmic tide against the shore of the quiet living room, and I was a statue, a monument to the terror and the beauty of an answered prayer you never dared to speak aloud. It had started as all our evenings had begun to start, with the key turning in the lock of my apartment door, a key I had given him months ago, ostensibly for emergencies, but which had become a casual instrument of entry, a signal that the boundary between his life and mine had eroded into something soft and permeable. He'd arrived with the city still clinging to him, the scent of exhaust and damp pavement, the weariness of a long day etched into the lines around his eyes. Sam worked in software, a world of clean logic and binary code that seemed so at odds with the beautiful, chaotic mess of his personality. He lived in a state of perpetual motion, a whirlwind of client meetings and project deadlines and social engagements that left him, at the end of the day, utterly spent. My apartment had become his harbor, the quiet place he could drift into when his own engine finally sputtered out. He hadn't said much. A tired smile, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every email he had answered that day. He dropped his messenger bag by the door, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto my worn, gray sofa as if his strings had been cut. I was in the kitchen, making tea, and by the time I returned with 2 steaming mugs, he was already halfway to sleep, his body curled into the cushions. I set the mugs down on the coasterless coffee table, a crime against wood finishing I only ever permitted for him. I watched him for a moment, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the slight parting of his lips, the absolute surrender in his posture. He was a fortress during the day, all sharp angles and confident assertions, but in sleep, he was a ruin, beautiful and unguarded. I sat down on the floor, my back against the opposite end of the sofa, intending to read, to give him space. But then he'd stirred, a low murmur in his throat, and before my mind could process the intent, his body was unfolding, shifting, and he had stretched out, laying his head not on a cushion, but directly into my lap. And then, stillness. His breathing deepened again, sinking back into the steady rhythm of sleep, and the world stopped. My own breath caught in my throat, a prisoner in my own chest. My entire universe shrank to the points of contact, the surprisingly heavy weight of his skull against my thighs, the warmth seeping through the denim of my jeans, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I could feel the soft whisper of his breath against my stomach with every exhale. My hands were frozen, hovering in the air above him like 2 useless birds. I didn't know where to put them. To touch his hair seemed like a transgression of an unspoken treaty, a violation of the fragile trust that allowed this moment to exist. To leave them suspended felt unnatural, a monument to my own paralysis. After an eternity that was likely only a minute, I slowly, carefully, lowered them to rest on the cushion beside me, my fingers curled into tight fists. Every nerve ending in my body was screaming. This was the precipice. This was the edge of the quiet, safe friendship we had built and the start of a terrifying, uncharted territory. He was asleep. For him, this was probably nothing, a thoughtless act of comfort-seeking, an unconscious migration toward warmth. For me, it was everything. It was a confession my body was making without my consent. It was the physical manifestation of a feeling I had spent years carefully packing away, storing in the deep, dark attic of my heart, where I hoped it would remain quiet and undisturbed. But here it was, out in the open, warm and heavy and breathing in my lap. And all I could do was sit there, in the dim light of my living room, and try to remember how to breathe. We had met in the rain. It feels like a cliché, the kind of scene written for a movie, but the universe rarely cares for originality when it's orchestrating the moments that will define you. It was October, a season when the city of Vancouver forgets what the sun looks like and settles into a state of perpetual, moody drizzle. I was a photographer, or at least, I was trying to be. My days were a patchwork of freelance gigs that barely paid the rent and long, solitary walks where I tried to capture the soul of the city in frames of light and shadow. I loved the rain. I loved the way it washed the world clean, deepening the colors of the brick buildings and turning the asphalt streets into black mirrors that reflected the bruised purple of the sky. I was standing under the meager shelter of a storefront awning, trying to shield my camera lens as I framed a shot of the steam rising from a manhole cover, a ghostly plume in the gray afternoon. I was so focused on the composition, on the dance of light and water, that I didn't notice him until he was right beside me. "You'll ruin your camera," he'd said. His voice was a warm, unexpected sound that cut through the rhythmic shush of the tires on the wet street. I looked up, startled. He was tall, with a spray of dark, unruly hair that was already beaded with moisture. He was holding a large, black umbrella, a sturdy-looking thing that seemed almost comically professional compared to the flimsy, inside-out skeletons that littered the city's trash cans on days like this. He was smiling, a genuine, easy smile that seemed entirely out of place in the dreary landscape. It was the kind of smile that suggested he carried his own source of light. "I'm trying not to," I'd replied, my own voice sounding rusty and unused. I gestured vaguely with the camera. "It's for a project." The way the light hits the wet pavement, I felt a sudden, foolish need to justify myself, to explain the strange poetry I was chasing. He nodded, his eyes following my gaze to the street. "I see it," he said, and the simple affirmation was like a gift. Most people just saw rain. He saw the light. He then did something that, in retrospect, was so quintessentially him. Without another word, he shifted his stance, extending the umbrella to cover not just himself, but me and my camera as well. It was a simple, thoughtless gesture of kindness, the kind people perform for strangers a dozen times a day. But it felt different. It was the creation of a small, shared space, a temporary shelter for two in the middle of a storm. We stood there for a moment in a comfortable silence, two strangers huddled under a circle of black nylon, while the city rushed by around us. "I'm Sam," he said finally, breaking the quiet. He offered a hand, which meant he had to awkwardly shift the umbrella to his other hand, a clumsy little dance that made me smile. "Leo," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and warm. That was how it began, not with a thunderclap, but with the gentle patter of rain on an umbrella. We talked for 20 minutes under that awning, about my photography and his work, about the city, about the particular melancholy of an autumn afternoon. When the rain finally eased to a reluctant mist, he offered to walk with me to the coffee shop I was heading to. He was on his way to a meeting, but he walked 5 blocks in the wrong direction just to keep talking. By the time we parted ways, I had his number in my phone and a strange, buoyant feeling in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee I was now holding. It was the feeling of an unexpected connection, a quiet recognition that I had just stumbled upon someone significant. I didn't know then that he was the beginning of a new chapter. I just knew that the gray day felt a little brighter. Our friendship grew organically, like a vine finding its way toward the sun. It was easy. With Sam, everything was easy. He pulled me out of my shell, that quiet, observational space I tended to inhabit, and into the world. He introduced me to his friends, a loud, cheerful group of people who welcomed me with an uncomplicated warmth. He dragged me to parties where I would spend most of the night in a corner, nursing a beer and people watching, but I was happy just to be in his orbit. He, in turn, seemed to find a kind of peace in my quiet. He would come to my apartment after a frantic week, and we would just exist in the same space without the need for constant conversation. He would scroll through his phone while I edited photos, the only sounds the soft click of my mouse and the hum of the refrigerator. It was a comfortable, domestic silence, the kind that speaks of deep trust. He was fascinated by my work. He would spend hours looking through my prints, asking me questions about f-stops and shutter speeds. But more than that, he wanted to know what I saw. How did you know to stand right here, at this exact moment, to catch the light like that? He would ask, his finger tracing the line of a sunbeam on a photograph of a dusty warehouse. He saw the art, but he also saw the patience, the quiet dedication it took. He saw me, and I, in turn, saw him. I saw the vulnerability beneath his confident exterior, the flicker of loneliness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. I saw the immense pressure he was under at his high-pressure consulting job, the weight of expectations he carried on his broad shoulders. I saw the deep well of kindness in him, the same kindness that had prompted him to share his umbrella with a stranger on a rainy street. It was somewhere in those early months, during a late-night conversation fueled by cheap pizza and cheaper wine, that I realized the nature of my feelings for him had undergone a quiet, seismic shift. We were sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by scattered prints from a recent project. He was talking about his childhood, about building tree houses with his brother, and the apartment was filled with the warm, low timbre of his voice. He laughed at a memory, a full, unrestrained sound that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, and in that moment, a trapdoor opened in my chest, and my heart simply fell through. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic realization. It was a quiet, simple, and terrifying certainty. I was in love with my best friend. I did what any rational, terrified person would do. I buried it. I packed the feeling into a lead-lined box and sunk it to the bottom of my own personal ocean. He was straight. He had a girlfriend, Jessica, a smart, funny lawyer he'd been with for 2 years. They were good together, their lives fitting into a neat, socially acceptable pattern. I was his friend, his safe harbor, his quiet place. To confess my feelings would be to detonate a bomb in the center of that peace. It would be selfish. It would ruin everything. So I became an expert in emotional alchemy, learning to transmute the raw material of love into the more acceptable alloy of friendship. I learned to interpret the casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, a playful shove, as nothing more than camaraderie. I learned to smile and offer advice when he talked about Jessica. I learned to live with the quiet, persistent ache in my chest, a constant companion that reminded me of the truth I was hiding. I became a masterful photographer of my own emotions, framing them in a way that concealed their true depth, cropping out the inconvenient parts, leaving only the image of a loyal, platonic friend. And for 3 years, that was enough. It had to be. The shift began, as so many shifts do, with an ending. Sam and Jessica broke up. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive event, but a slow, sad erosion. A mutual parting of ways, he'd told me. The kind of breakup that is almost more painful for its lack of a villain, its lack of clear-cut anger. There was no one to blame, just the quiet, heartbreaking realization that they wanted different futures, that the paths they were walking had diverged so gradually they hadn't noticed until they were miles apart. He called me the night it happened, his voice thick and strange over the phone. He didn't cry. He just sounded hollowed out, an empty vessel where a future used to be. "Can I come over?" he'd asked, and it wasn't a question. It was a plea. Of course, I'd said. Of course. He arrived at my door looking like a ghost of himself. The usual light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, exhausted emptiness. He didn't want to talk about it, not really. He just wanted to not be alone. We sat on the couch and watched a stupid action movie, the explosions and car chases a meaningless, noisy wallpaper over the vast, echoing silence of his grief. I made him tea. He barely touched it. At some point, he fell asleep, his head slumping against the back of the couch, his face slack with a kind of sorrowful peace. I watched him for a long time before I got a blanket from my bedroom and draped it over him. It was the first time he'd ever slept at my apartment. It would not be the last. That night marked the beginning of a new phase in our friendship, a blurring of boundaries that was both terrifying and intoxicating. My apartment, which had always been his harbor, now became his home. He started showing up most nights, often with the flimsiest of excuses. "My place just feels too quiet," he'd say. Or, "I didn't feel like cooking." I never questioned it. I just made space for him. I started buying the kind of cereal he liked. I cleared a shelf in the bathroom for his toothbrush and contact lens solution. His presence began to weave itself into the fabric of my daily life. His shoes by the door, his jacket slung over a dining chair, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air long after he'd left for work in the morning. He was seeking comfort, I knew that. He was a man adrift, his emotional anchor gone, and he was clinging to the nearest, sturdiest thing he could find, which happened to be me. I understood it on a logical level, but my heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, refused to be logical. It saw the increased proximity, the casual intimacy, and it began to hope. It was a dangerous, fragile kind of hope, the kind you're afraid to even breathe on for fear it will shatter. He was leaning on me, but it was a desperate, unconscious kind of leaning. He needed a friend, and my own desperate, secret love was a complication he couldn't afford, and a truth I couldn't bear to reveal. I was walking a tightrope, suspended over a chasm of my own making. Every gesture, every word, had to be carefully weighed. I had to be his rock, his steady presence, while inside I was a churning sea of anxiety and longing. The couch became the epicenter of this new, fragile dynamic. It was where the unspoken things happened. It began with him falling asleep during movies, a common occurrence that slowly evolved. One night, he shifted in his sleep, his arm falling across my lap. I froze, my body rigid, but he didn't move. He just sighed, a soft sound of contentment, and settled deeper into his slumber. Another night, we were sitting side by side, our shoulders and thighs pressed together as we watched some documentary. I was acutely aware of every point of contact, the warmth of his body seeping into mine, a low, electric hum beneath my skin. For him, it was just proximity. For me, it was a form of exquisite torture. I became a student of his exhaustion, a scholar of his weariness. I could tell by the slump of his shoulders when he walked through the door what kind of day he'd had. I knew the specific sigh that meant a client had been difficult, and the other, deeper sigh that spoke of a more profound, existential tiredness. He was running from the emptiness of his own apartment, from the silence where his relationship used to be. He was filling the void with my presence, and I was letting him. I was letting him because I was selfish. Because a part of me, the part one refused to acknowledge in the bright light of day, savored this new dependence. It was a pale imitation of the intimacy I craved, but it was something. It was a ghost of a meal, but it was enough to keep the hunger at bay. And so the ritual began. It wasn't spoken of, never planned. It simply happened, and then it happened again, and again, until it became a silent agreement, a new pattern etched into the blueprint of our friendship. The ritual of the couch. Most nights, he would end up there, stretched out, the city's chaos finally releasing its grip on him in the quiet sanctuary of my living room. I would let him sleep for an hour or two, working quietly on my laptop at the dining table, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the space. The air would be thick with unspoken things, with the weight of his grief and my love, a silent, charged atmosphere that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Then, I would go over to the couch, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. "Sam," I'd whisper, my voice always softer than I intended. "You should go to bed." The first few times, he had roused himself, a groggy, disoriented look on his face, and stumbled back to his own empty apartment. But then one night, he just blinked his eyes open, looked at me with a raw, unguarded vulnerability, and murmured, "Can I just stay here?" He meant the couch. I knew he meant the couch. I brought him my best pillow and the heavy quilt from my bed, and I tucked him in as if he were a child. I went to my own room, closed the door, and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of his breathing form just one thin wall away. The ritual evolved. The couch became a less frequent destination. Instead, his question changed. It was a subtle shift, but a significant one. "Is it okay if I crash here tonight?" he'd ask, and the here was no longer explicitly the couch. It was the apartment. It was my space. And my answer was always the same. Of course, a few weeks into this new arrangement, another shift occurred. He'd fallen asleep on the couch again, and when I went to wake him, he'd looked up at me, his eyes clouded with sleep. "My back is killing me on this thing," he mumbled, a half-hearted complaint. I felt a pang of something, guilt, maybe, or an opportunity. "You can take my bed," I offered, the words feeling huge and clumsy in my mouth. "I can take the couch," he shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No, man, I can't kick you out of your own bed," he paused, and in that small gap of silence, a new possibility hung in the air, shimmering and dangerous. "It's a big bed," he said, his voice quiet, questioning. "We could. I mean, if you're okay with it. We could just share." My heart stopped. It literally felt as if it ceased to beat for a solid second. This was it. This was the unspoken thing being spoken. This was the line. And I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that my answer would change everything. I could have said no. I could have insisted he take the bed and I the couch. It would have been the sensible, self-protective thing to do. It would have reinforced the boundary, kept the friendship safe. But I was so tired of being safe. I was so tired of the ache of wanting him. And this felt like a step closer, a dangerous, reckless step into the fire. "Okay," I said, and the word was a whisper. "Yeah, okay." So began the next phase of the ritual of the shared bed. It was a masterclass in plausible deniability. We were two friends, saving one of us from a sore back. It was practical, logical. It was anything but. The first night was an exercise in pure, unadulterated tension. I lay on my side of the queen-sized mattress, my body rigid, my muscles coiled as tight as springs. I tried to take up as little space as possible, to create a vast, empty continent between us. He did the same. We were two statues lying inches apart, the air between us crackling with a static charge. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could hear every single breath he took. Sleep felt like an impossible dream. But slowly, night after night, the tension eased. The invisible wall between us began to dissolve. One night, I woke up to find his arm thrown casually over my waist. I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow, my entire being focused on the warm, heavy weight of his arm. He was asleep, completely oblivious. I should have moved, should have gently dislodged him, but I couldn't. I just lay there, soaking in the illicit comfort, until the sun began to stream through the blinds and he stirred, pulling his arm back with a mumbled, sleepy apology that I pretended not to hear. Another night, it was I who turned in my sleep, my hand coming to rest on his back. I felt the solid, warm expanse of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath my palm, and a sense of profound, heartbreaking rightness washed over me. This became our new normal, a quiet, domestic arrangement shrouded in ambiguity. During the day, we were friends, our interactions comfortably platonic. But at night, in the darkness of my bedroom, we were something else. We were two bodies sharing a space, seeking warmth and comfort, our limbs tangling in sleep, our breaths mingling in the quiet air. He never spoke of it in the morning. He would wake up, run a hand through his messy hair, and thank me for letting him stay. He would talk about work, about a funny email he got, about his plans for the day. He acted as if nothing had happened, as if the nightly intimacy was a dream we both agreed to forget upon waking. And I followed his lead. I never questioned it. I never asked what it meant. I was too afraid of the answer. I was terrified that if I gave voice to the question, the fragile, beautiful, and agonizing world we had built in the dark would shatter into a million pieces. So I lived a double life, the supportive friend in the daylight, and the silent, yearning lover in the dark. And I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew that something had to break. The tension was a wire pulled too taut. It could not hold forever. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday. It was raining, a relentless, driving rain that lashed against the windows of my apartment, isolating us from the rest of the world. It was a fitting soundtrack for the storm that had been gathering inside me for months. Sam had a terrible day at work. A major project he'd been leading for months had hit a critical snag, and he'd come home defeated, the weight of it pressing him down. He didn't even make it to the couch. He just slumped into a kitchen chair, head in his hands, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. I didn't say anything. I just made us dinner, a simple pasta, and we ate in a near-total silence. The only sounds the clinking of our forks and the drumming of the rain. Later, we found ourselves in the bedroom, the ritual beginning without any words needing to be exchanged. We got into bed, the familiar tension settling over us, but tonight it felt different. It was heavier, charged with the melancholy of the day. We lay on our respective sides, back to back, two separate islands in the same sea. The silence stretched on, filled with the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. I could feel him, wide awake behind me. His breathing was too shallow, too controlled for sleep. I was staring at the faint shadows the streetlights cast on my wall, tracing the patterns with my eyes, my mind a chaotic whirl of everything I couldn't say. Then, his voice, a low whisper that barely disturbed the air. "Leo." I turned, my body moving slowly, cautiously, as if a sudden movement might shatter the delicate stillness. He had turned as well. We were facing each other now, two silhouettes in the dim, gray light filtering through the window. I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark pools of his eyes. "Yeah," I whispered back, my throat tight. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could feel the struggle in him, the words being weighed and measured before they were spoken. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual confidence. It was a confession. It was an admission of the very ambiguity I had been living and breathing for months. He was finally acknowledging the space between us. "It's okay," I said, the automatic, useless response of a friend. "No," he said, and there was a new intensity in his voice. "It's not. It's not fair to you." He shifted closer, the mattress dipping with his weight. He was so close now I could feel his breath on my face, warm and soft. You're the only thing that feels real right now, Leo. The only thing that makes sense. Everything else is just noise. But I come here, and it's quiet. You're quiet." My heart was a hummingbird, beating its wings against my ribs so furiously I was sure he could hear it. This was it. The wire was about to snap. I held my breath, waiting. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating in the air for a fraction of a second before they came to rest on my cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt that shot through my entire body. His thumb stroked my skin, a slow, tentative gesture that spoke volumes. It was not the touch of a friend. It was something else, something new and terrifying and beautiful. His eyes searched mine in the darkness, and I knew he was looking for permission, for a sign. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with all the weight of the past 3 years. All the unspoken feelings, all the carefully guarded secrets, all the nights of agonizing proximity. It was all there, in that one, simple, earth-shattering question. He was giving me a choice. He was giving me an out. I could say no, and in the morning, we could pretend this never happened. We could go back to being friends, the boundary restored, the line uncrossed. Or I could say yes, and step off the cliff with him, into the unknown. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The words were trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat. Instead, I gave him my answer. I leaned forward, closing the last few inches between us, and I kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, not the kind of fiery, desperate kiss you see in movies. It was impossibly gentle. It was tentative, questioning. It was the soft press of his lips against mine, a moment of profound, terrifying stillness. It was a confession, a surrender, an apology, and a prayer, all at once. His lips were soft, and they tasted faintly of the mint tea we'd had earlier. I felt the slight scratch of his evening stubble against my skin. In that one, simple point of contact, the entire world fell away. There was no rain, no city, no past, no future. There was only the here and now, the darkness of the room, and the astonishing, unbelievable reality of his mouth on mine. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he pulled back, just a fraction of an inch, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our eyes closed, the silence in the room now a different kind of silence. It was no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a fragile, trembling peace. The wire had snapped. The fault line had given way. And in the quiet aftermath, nothing would ever be the same. The aftermath was silence. A deafening, crushing silence. When I woke up the next morning, the space beside me in the bed was empty. It was not just empty, it was cold. The indentation of his body on the mattress was gone, the sheets smooth and undisturbed. He had left before the sun was up, a quiet phantom slipping out of my apartment and, it seemed, out of my life. There was no note. His keys were still on the hook by the door, a cruel, mocking testament to the access he still had, but his presence was gone. The apartment felt cavernous, the air thin and brittle. The gentle peace of the night before had evaporated with the morning light, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of dread in the pit of my stomach. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety. I checked my phone every 5 minutes, my thumb hovering over his name in my contacts, my mind composing and deleting a dozen different messages. A simple "Hey, are you okay?" felt too loaded. A casual "morning" felt insane. Anything that acknowledged the kiss felt like it would be applying too much pressure to a fragile, fractured thing. So I said nothing. And he said nothing. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. The silence from him was an active thing, a physical presence in the room. It was a statement. It was a retreat. I had stepped off the cliff, and it seemed I was falling alone. The pain was a physical thing. It was a hollow ache in my chest, a tightness in my throat. I had allowed myself, for one brief, beautiful moment, to hope. I had let the carefully constructed walls around my heart crumble, and the kiss had been a glimpse of the sun. Now, the walls were gone, and all I felt was the cold. I had misinterpreted everything. His loneliness, his need for comfort. I had twisted it into something it wasn't. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a mistake. A moment of weakness and confusion on his part, and a moment of catastrophic, hopeful foolishness on mine. I had not just risked our friendship. I had shattered it. The quiet observer had finally acted, and in doing so, had destroyed the very thing he had been trying to preserve. For 2 days, the silence continued. 2 days of me pacing my apartment, of replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for some clue I had missed. I oscillated between a deep, profound hurt and a hot, simmering frustration. How could he do this? How could he initiate something so intimate, so vulnerable, and then just disappear? How could he ask that question, draw that confession from me, and then vanish as if it meant nothing? The kindness I had always admired in him, the easy warmth, now felt like a cruel deception. The man who had shared his umbrella with a stranger seemed incapable of sending a simple text message to his best friend. On the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I would rather have a painful truth than this agonizing, empty silence. I needed to know where I stood. I needed to hear it from him, even if the words were going to break me. So I did the one thing I had been avoiding. I picked up my phone, my hand trembling slightly, and I called him. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up, my courage failing, when he answered. "Hey," he said. His voice was strained, distant, the voice of a polite stranger, not the warm, familiar voice of my best friend. "Hey," I replied, my own voice sounding small and weak. "Can we talk?" There was a pause, a hesitation that felt like a physical blow. "I'm really busy at work. Leo, Sam, please," I said, and I hated the pleading note in my voice, but I couldn't help it. "Just please. I'll come to you. Your office. A coffee shop. Anywhere. 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Another long, agonizing pause. Then a sigh. A tired, defeated sound. "Okay," he said. "The coffee shop near my office. In an hour." Then he hung up. The coffee shop was neutral territory, a sterile, impersonal space filled with the scent of burnt coffee and the low hum of conversations I didn't care about. I got there early, chose a small table in the corner, and waited. My stomach was a knot of nerves. When he walked in, he looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with a kind of weary reluctance, as if every step was a monumental effort. He wouldn't meet my eyes as he sat down. He just stared at the scarred surface of the table between us. "What do you want, Leo?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The question, so blunt and cold, stung. "I want to know what happened," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "I want to know why you disappeared." I thought we were friends." He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were filled with a confusing mixture of frustration and something that looked like pain. "We are friends," he said, his voice rising slightly. "That's the whole point. That's what we are." And I messed it up. I crossed a line. "You asked," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You asked if it was okay." And I answered. He winced, looking away again. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. I know I did. And I shouldn't have. I was confused, and I was a mess, and I leaned on you. I used you, Leo. I used your kindness, and I dragged you into my own chaos, and that wasn't fair. The kiss, it was a mistake. I'm sorry." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the most vulnerable parts of me. A mistake. That's all it was. A byproduct of his grief, a moment of confusion. It had meant nothing. The hope that had been a flickering candle inside me for the past few days was finally, brutally extinguished. All that was left was a cold, bitter anger. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "So for the last 3 months, when you've been sleeping in my bed, when you've been holding on to me in your sleep, was that all just a mistake too? Was it just a convenient way to not be alone?" He flinched as if I'd struck him. "That's not," he started, but he couldn't finish. He couldn't lie. "Not about that. You know, for someone who talks for a living, you're terrible at this," I said, the frustration finally bubbling over into a quiet, cutting sarcasm. "You're hiding, Sam. You're hiding behind excuses and apologies because you're terrified. I don't know what you're terrified of, whether it's me or yourself or what that kiss actually meant, but this, right here, this is cowardly. You owe me more than this. You owe our friendship more than this. So either be honest with me, for once, or just tell me you want me to leave you alone. But don't you dare call what happened between us a mistake and pretend that's the end of the story." I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. My hands were shaking. I had said my piece. I had laid my heart, my anger, and my hurt out on the table. The ball was in his court. He just sat there, staring at me, his face a mask of shock and confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite read. I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him alone with my words and the deafening silence that had started it all. I didn't know if I had saved our friendship or if I had just signed its death certificate. But for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The silence had been broken. The rest was up to him. The key turned in my lock late that night. I was sitting in the dark, on the couch where this whole agonizing ritual had begun. I hadn't moved for hours. I was just staring out the window at the city lights, feeling a profound and bottomless emptiness. I didn't turn when I heard the door open and close. I knew it was him. I felt his presence in the room, a disturbance in the static air. He stood by the door for a long time, and I just waited, my heart a slow, heavy drum. Finally, he moved, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. He didn't turn on the lights. He just came and sat on the other end of the couch, leaving a careful, deliberate space between us. "You were right," he said, his voice low and raspy in the darkness. "I was a coward. I am a coward." I didn't say anything. I just kept looking out the window. He took a deep, shaky breath. I'm not good at this," he began, his words halting, uncertain. "Feelings. Talking about them. All my life, I've just pushed through. I build things, I solve problems, I follow a logical path. There's no logic to this. To us," he paused. "After Jessica and I broke up, my whole world felt untethered. Like I was floating in this cold, empty space. And your apartment, being with you, it was the only anchor I had. You were solid. You were real. And it was quiet here. I needed the quiet." He shifted on the couch, turning to face me, though I still didn't look at him. I didn't realize what was happening at first. I just knew I felt better when I was here. I felt safe. The sleeping on the couch, the sharing the bed. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was just what friends do. But it wasn't. It was me. needing to be close to you. I just couldn't admit it to myself. He fell silent for a moment, and I could hear the emotion thickening his voice when he spoke again. That night, when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. That's what I told myself the next morning, because I was terrified. It was the most honest thing I've done in years, and it scared the hell out of me. Because it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very, very long time. And I didn't know what that meant. About me. About us. About everything I thought I knew about myself. So I ran. I ran because I didn't know how to face it. How to face you finally. I turned my head and looked at him. In the faint glow from the window, I could see the glint of tears in his eyes. His face was a landscape of vulnerability, all his usual defenses stripped away. He looked broken and lost, and so incredibly beautiful it made my chest ache. "What does it mean, Sam?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know what it means. All I know is that the last 3 days, without you, have been the worst 3 days of my life." The silence was unbearable. "I don't want that silence anymore, Leo. I don't want to be a coward. I want to be here, with you, and I want to figure it out. If you'll let me," his confession, so raw and broken and honest, washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of my anger and hurt. All that was left was a deep, quiet empathy. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man, lost and afraid, trying to navigate a map of a country he'd never known existed. And he was asking me to be his guide, or at least to walk beside him while he figured it out. I closed the space between us on the couch. I took his hand, his fingers cold and trembling, and laced them with my own. His grip was surprisingly tight, a desperate, clinging hold. I brought his hand up and rested it against my cheek, turning my face into his palm. "Okay," I whispered, the word a promise, an absolution. "We'll figure it out." Together, he let out a shuddering breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and then he leaned in, his head coming to rest on my shoulder. And we just sat there for a long, long time in the quiet darkness. Not as friends, not as lovers, but as two people who had finally stopped running. We were just two people holding on in the peaceful, honest silence we were finally beginning to create together. The days that followed were like the first, tentative moments of a sunrise after a long and violent storm. There was a fragility to the light, a cautious warmth that promised a new day but still held the memory of the darkness. We didn't try to define what we were. The words, boyfriend, partner, lover, felt too heavy, too solid for the delicate, shimmering thing we were building. Instead, we focused on the small, tangible acts of rebuilding. We talked. For hours. We laid the foundations of our friendship bare, examining every beam and joist, and then we began to build something new on top of it, something that incorporated the honesty we had fought so hard to find. He still stayed at my apartment, but it was different now. There was no pretext, no plausible deniability. He was there because he wanted to be there with me. His key in the lock was no longer a sign of his need for escape, but a declaration of his desire to come home. We still shared the bed, but the vast, empty continent between us was gone, replaced by a comfortable, intentional closeness. Some nights we would talk until the early hours of the morning, our voices low whispers in the dark, sharing stories and fears we had never voiced before. Other nights, we would simply lie in a comfortable silence, my head on his chest, his arm around me, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart a lullaby that soothed the anxious, frayed edges of my own. It was in these quiet, domestic moments that I felt the true landscape of our relationship shifting. It was in the way he started making the coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it without ever having to ask. It was in the way I would find myself smiling while editing photos, just knowing he was in the next room. It was in the casual, easy touches that were no longer fraught with unspoken meaning, but were simply expressions of a quiet, growing affection, a hand on the small of my back as we passed in the hallway, his fingers brushing mine when he handed me a mug, the way he would reach out and touch my hair, just for a second, as if to reassure himself that I was real. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after our confrontation, I was in my darkroom, the small, windowless space filled with the sharp, chemical scent of developer and the soft, magical red glow of the safe light. It had always been my sanctuary, a place of solitude where I could create, where I could be alone with my thoughts and my images. I was watching a print emerge in the tray, the ghost of an image slowly resolving into a concrete picture, a rain-slicked street, not unlike the one where we had met. The door creaked open, spilling a sliver of white light into the room before it was quickly shut again. Sam stood there, a dark silhouette against the red glow. "Sorry," he whispered. "Didn't mean to ruin anything, it's okay," I said, my eyes still on the developing print. "You can come in." He moved to stand beside me, his presence a warm, solid shape in the small space. He watched the image appear in the tray, his expression one of quiet fascination. "It's like magic," he murmured. "It's just chemistry," I said, but I smiled. We stood there for a while, in the strange, intimate twilight of the darkroom, watching my memories take shape. He didn't ask questions. He just watched, sharing the quiet, creative process with me. After a few minutes, he reached out, his hand finding mine in the darkness. He didn't say anything. He just held it, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. And in that simple, silent gesture, I understood everything. My darkroom, my most private, solitary space, was no longer just mine. The door I had always kept closed was now open to him. He was not an intruder in my solitude. He was a welcome presence within it. We were not just two separate people sharing a space anymore. Our lives were beginning to merge, our edges blurring, creating a new shape that was uniquely ours. He was still the whirlwind, and I was still the quiet center, but now, his motion felt less frantic, and my stillness felt less lonely. We were finding our equilibrium, our balance. We were learning to heal, not just from the wounds we had inflicted on each other in our fear and confusion, but from the older, deeper wounds of loneliness we had both carried for so long. There are moments in your life that are not moments at all, but quiet, continuous revelations. They are not earthquakes, but the slow, patient growth of a tree, its roots deepening, its branches reaching for the sun. The grand, dramatic gestures are not what define a life or a love. It is the small, repeated acts of kindness. It is the shared silence. It is the comfort of a familiar presence in the dark. It is the feeling of a hand reaching for yours, not in a moment of crisis, but in a moment of simple, ordinary peace. He was no longer just the man who had shared his umbrella with me on a rainy street. He was the man who had weathered the storm with me, who had been brave enough to admit he was lost, and who had, in the end, found his way home. And I, the quiet observer, had finally learned that the most beautiful pictures are not the ones you capture with a lens, but the ones you build, slowly and carefully, in the beautiful, honest silence you learn to create together.